Hi everybody, my name's Darius Kazemi. I'm speaking to you from my home in Boston, Massachusetts, although at this exact moment I'm probably in an airplane on the way to California and missing critical proximity, so I'm really jealous of you all who could be there today. Anyway, you might know me as the guy who wrote Fuck Video Games, but I'm actually here today in my capacity as the author of a forthcoming book on the 1999 turn-based strategy game Jagged Alliance 2, published by the fine people at Boss Fight Books. My book attempts to illuminate interesting things about one of my favorite games by focusing on the material realities of development. It's heavily based on interviews with developers and also my readings of the game's source code. So you might ask, why even bother to look at source code at all? It's a valid question, especially when technological determinism and the reductionism that it brings has been such a pervasive negative force in the last couple of decades of dialogue about video games. So I'm absolutely not saying that source code is the only important factor when looking at a game, but what I am saying is it's ridiculous to not look at source code if you have it at your disposal. So what is source code? It might seem self-evident, but there's actually many layers to what can be considered source code for a game. For example, a simple game on, say, an Atari VCS has only one layer of code. The game programmers providing instructions directly to the hardware. I've highlighted the code part here in red just in case that wasn't clear. Code talks to the computer, talks to the input and output, talks to the player, and it goes back and forth. A modern game, and by which I mean anything made after, say, 1995, looks a lot more like this. This is a simplification too, but you get the gist. As we study a game and its source code, it's not 100% clear where we should be looking. There's the core game code, which is kind of obviously something we should look at, but then there's also gameplay stuff implemented in a scripting language separate from the game code usually. Then there's the third-party engine, like the Unreal Engine or Unity. Do we want to spend our time digging into how Unreal works? Maybe. What about the limitations of the operating system? Is that too abstract? How about the difference between OpenGL and DirectX? What about the maps? They often contain code and logic embedded in them. Triggers for if the player walks into this room, then do X, Y, Z. That's code, even though it was laid out visually by a map designer. It's not cut and dry what code is, really. And the reason I bring this all up is that it may only be possible to find one of these components that you can look at, and that's okay. I believe that the modding tools released in Skyrim, for example, might as well be considered source code, as they reveal things about the inner workings of Skyrim's data structures and logic paths. So, how do you find a game's source code? Aside from the obvious Google for it, the main thing you need to look for is a modding community. If a game has a dedicated modding community, then the modders need to be able to work on it somehow, and usually they manage to get the source code either legally or paralegally, let's say. Maybe not paralegally, extra-legally, whatever. I ended up finding the source code for Jagged Alliance 2 by going to the main Jagged Alliance 2 modding community message board and searching it. It took me about 30 minutes and a lot of dead free file hosting URLs that I had to comb through, but eventually I did find it, and it actually is legally released, thank goodness. So go to the mod community, reach out, do the work. So what do we do when we get our hands on the source code? Well, the first thing that I try to do is get a sense for how it's organized. Here's the source code for Spear of Destiny, which is a mini-sequel to Wolfenstein 3D released in late 1992. All the source code is in a single directory, and if you look at the files, you'll see they're organized by prepending strings to their name. Audio stuff starts with audio, graphics stuff starts with GFX, core utilities start with ID for id software, and Wolfenstein itself is in these WL files, presumably standing for Wolfenstein. We might want to start by surveying the code, and if you don't have anything better to go on, use your intuition. Worst case, you can scan over every file. But at this stage, you don't have to read every single line of source code. You just want to skim through and understand the lay of the land, so you just want to read and skim as you go. So let's look at this one, WL main. I picked main because it's typically an important file in any given game. And so we see here, all right, written by John Carmack, and we have some variables that get declared, nothing too interesting. Reading and writing the configuration file, and this is literally how fast I look through it. I just kind of scroll through until I find something interesting. New game, okay, hey, this is where the health gets set. This is where they tell you start with a pistol. This is where you get 3 lives. Remember when games had lives? So we scroll through the file, and eventually we get down to the bottom, and we see something interesting here. It says this is for beta only, and it gets the current date, and it says if the date is past a certain year, day, and month, then print out, sorry, beta testing's over. Well, that's interesting. The date is not actually specified here, but what we can do is we can use our built-in search tool here, and any search tool that you have is good as long as it will search inside the files themselves. And I'm going to look for the word year, and we see the code that we just looked at, and then if we scroll down, we see year, month, and day, September 30th, 1992. So now we know that beta testing for Spear of Destiny ended on September 30th, 1992. Well, that's kind of a cool fact, and that's only after looking at the file for a few minutes. Before I move on, I just want to take a brief break and say that you don't need to be an expert programmer to read source code. If you've had one class in computer programming or have taken some online tutorials or whatever, you can read source code, right? This is not hard to read here. Year 1992. I'm not even a C programmer, and I can read this source code. It doesn't really matter what the technical details are. You can probably find something interesting and worth commenting on. So now I'm going to switch over to the Jagged Alliance 2 source code, because I want to show you examples of the kind of things you can find in the code. For those unfamiliar with Jagged Alliance, this is an XCOM style game where there's an overworld map that lets you plan strategy and tactical maps where squad-based battles happen. I found this in the source code of the strategic layer of the game, specifically in a file called Strategic AI. It seemed important, so it was the first one I opened. What we have here is a 300-word essay penned by one of the game developers laying out the overall philosophy behind the design of the Strategic AI. It's a beautiful piece of writing about game design, and I think it's even more beautiful because it was inserted directly into the source code as a way to guide people who are working on the AI on a day-to-day basis. So this is an extreme example of comments which are really just plain language texts embedded in code. I don't have access to any of the design documents for Jagged Alliance 2, but I do have this, and I think it's incredible that by looking at the source code, something like this could be dug up and exposed to the world. It tells us something about the game that we didn't know before. There are also examples of aesthetic beauty to be found in source code. I'm going to switch over to something from the core tactical battle code, which is where squads of soldiers do turn-based battles. This table sticks out kind of like a sore thumb. I'm just going to zoom out so you can see what it looks like in the context of everything else. So we got some tables up here, and then the rest of this looks like regular code. So this just stuck out to me as soon as I opened the file. So I'll make it big again. And what it is, it's a kind of estimation table that says, hey, if I'm looking south and there's someone to the north of me, then they are behind me. If I'm looking south and there's someone to the east of me, then they are to my side. It's an elegant piece of code that's not only pretty to look at, but it also shows that the developers were not concerned with simulationist realism. They were fine with estimating angles rather than calculating them explicitly every time. And if you understand other things about Jagged Alliance 2 and its community, you know that there's a tension about simulation and accuracy throughout the series' history. So this is kind of an interesting thing to see right there in Jagged Alliance 2. Anyway, that's all the time I have for my talk right now, but I encourage every one of you to look at source code. Web games, Twine games, old games, new games. You'd be surprised by what's out there and what you can find, even if you don't have a whole lot of technical background. Anyway, thanks for listening to me, and I hope to see you later this week in San Francisco once I actually get here. Thanks a bunch.